Saha Airlines Boeing 707. On January 14, 2019, a Boeing 707 cargo jet operated by Saha Airlines approached the skies over Iran with a load of meat from Kyrgyzstan. At 42 years old, the aircraft was a relic, one of the last civil Boeing 707s still flying anywhere in the world. But in its final moments, the aging jet was set on a collision course with tragedy. The crew, aiming for Payam International Airport, lined up instead with Fath Air Base, a strip less than half the length required for a heavy 707. Poor weather and the near-parallel alignment of the runways made the error heartbreakingly easy to make, but the consequences were anything but forgiving. Touching down at Fath, the jet had no chance to stop. It tore past the end of the 4,300-foot runway, plowed through a barrier wall, and slammed into a house before erupting into flames. Security cameras captured the fiery crash, showing an explosion that lit the winter sky and left the aircraft unrecognizable. Remarkably, the homes struck were empty, sparing those on the ground. For those aboard, the story was almost entirely different. 15 of the 16 crew members lost their lives in the inferno. Only one man emerged from the wreckage alive, flight engineer Farshad Madavinejad. Pulled from the burning remains in critical condition, he was rushed to Shariati Hospital. His survival against the odds became one of the few human fragments left from a disaster that erased a $25 million aircraft and silenced an entire crew in seconds. Investigators later recovered the cockpit voice recorder, flight data recorder, and control display unit, seeking answers to how such a mistake was allowed to unfold. The accident echoed earlier tragedies in aviation history, where a moment's misjudgment of a runway ended in catastrophe. Here, a decades-old aircraft, a short runway, and human error converged into a story of loss that closed the chapter on one of the last 707s still in the skies. Sudan Airways Flight 2241. On October 21, 2009, Sudan Airways Flight 2241, a Boeing 707 cargo jet leased from Aza Transport, thundered down the runway at Sharjah International Airport with a load of air conditioning units, car parts, and tools bound for Khartoum. At its helm was Captain Mohammed El Halfawi, a 61-year-old aviator with nearly 20,000 hours of flight experience alongside his crew of 5. The aircraft, built in 1968 and once a proud workhorse for Lufthansa, was already a relic, yet it still carried the weight of global commerce. Seconds after liftoff, something went terribly wrong. The number 4 engine cowling ripped away, debris tumbling into the air. Believing they faced an engine power loss, the crew attempted to bank back toward the airport. But in their sharp maneuver, the 707 exceeded its limits. Aerodynamics betrayed them, the wings stalled, and the jet plummeted barely a mile from the runway. A fireball consumed the aircraft as it struck the ground, killing all 6 on board. CCTV footage later confirmed the horror. A jet struggling in the sky, banking hard before disappearing into flames beyond the perimeter. The blackened wreckage left behind was unrecognizable, a $20 million aircraft reduced to smoldering debris. The victims included not only the flight deck crew, but also a ground engineer and 2 loadmasters, all of whom had dedicated careers in aviation. Investigators recovered both the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, only to find they were useless. Neither had captured the doomed flight's final moments. What emerged from the inquiry was chilling. The cowling separation severed an engine pressure line, but the aircraft remained flyable. It was the excessive bank angle, an overcorrection to a frightening situation, that sealed its fate. Within months, Aza Transport was banned in the UAE and soon collapsed entirely, leaving Flight 2241 as a stark reminder of how one mechanical failure and one critical misjudgment can erase every layer of safety meant to protect those in the sky. Prestige Airlines Boeing 707. On the morning of July 4, 2002, a Boeing 707 chartered by Prestige Airlines lifted off from N'Djamena, Chad, with 30 people on board and a destination set for Brazzaville in the Republic of the Congo. The aircraft, registered 9XRYS, carried mostly Chadian passengers along with a crew of 9. For the first leg of its journey, nothing seemed unusual. Then came a problem that spiraled into disaster. The landing gear failed to retract. Faced with a technical fault that raised questions about the aircraft's safety, the crew made a critical decision: divert to Bangui Airport in the Central African Republic. It was meant to be a precautionary move, a safer option to get the jet on the ground before matters worsened. Instead, the diversion marked the beginning of a fight for survival. As the 707 approached Bangui just after 11 a.m., witnesses on the ground noticed something unnerving. There was no familiar roar of jet engines. Survivors later confirmed what many suspected: the engines had gone silent. In an effort to lighten the load for an emergency landing, the crew may have dumped too much fuel, and now the aircraft had nothing left to give. At barely 2 miles from the runway, the jet dipped too low and slammed into the neighborhood of Gitangola. The impact tore through the fuselage, sending flames and debris across the area. A house roof caved in from the force, though no one on the ground was killed. Inside the aircraft, 28 people perished instantly. Only 2 survived: the flight engineer, Laurent Tabaco, and a passenger from Chad, pulled from the wreckage and rushed to the hospital. The crash left behind not only wreckage worth tens of millions of dollars, but also a haunting lesson. One technical failure, compounded by human decision-making under pressure, can erase nearly an entire flight in a matter of seconds. Transair Service Flight 671. On March 31, 1992, Transair Service Flight 671, a Boeing 707 cargo jet carrying 38 tons of freight, lifted off from Luxembourg bound for Kano, Nigeria. At the controls was a seasoned crew led by 57-year-old Swedish captain Ingemar Berglund, a man with 26,000 flight hours, supported by British First Officer Martin Emery and engineer Terry Boone. Midway through its climb over southeastern France at 32,000 feet, the calm was broken by a deafening double bang. The aircraft shuddered, rolled right, and alarms filled the cockpit. When the crew looked out, they saw the unthinkable. Engine number 4 was gone, ripped clean from the wing. Moments later, engine number 3 separated as well, torn away by the first engine's violent departure. 2 engines from the same wing, weighing several tons each and worth millions of dollars, had vanished into the sky. For any pilot, this is the stuff of nightmares. Yet Berglund fought to keep the jet stable, as Emery sent out a mayday. With the right wing ablaze and systems straining, the crew aimed for Istres-le-Toubé Air Base near Marseille. The approach required a left-hand circuit, a nearly impossible maneuver for an aircraft crippled on one side. Emery's steady voice repeated, "Left turn," urging Berglund through the moment. Against all odds, the 707 touched down at 10:35 a.m., veering off the runway but staying intact. Flames licked at the wing, but every one of the 5 men walked away unhurt. Investigators later traced the disaster to metal fatigue inside the engine pylons. A crack, invisible yet deadly, had spread until the structure failed. One engine's violent exit tore away its neighbor. The $20 million aircraft was lost, but the flight became a textbook case of skill under pressure. The crew's actions earned them the Hugh Gordon Burge Memorial Award, a recognition reserved for aviators who demonstrate extraordinary airmanship in the face of catastrophe. Millon Air Flight 406. On October 22, 1996, a Boeing 707 cargo jet lifted off from Manta, Ecuador, bound for Miami. The aircraft, operated by Millon Air and carrying frozen fish among other freight, struggled almost immediately after leaving the runway. Within moments, the 4-engine jet lost power, clipped the bell tower of La Dolorosa Catholic Church, and plowed into a nearby residential neighborhood. The crash left the aircraft in flames, scattering debris across dozens of homes. All 4 crew members on board died, and the destruction extended far beyond the airport fence. 30 people on the ground were killed, and 50 more were injured in the chaos. The aircraft itself, tail number N751MA, already carried a troubled history. Built in 1967, it had been flying for nearly 3 decades, passing from American Airlines to Millon Air. It had a record of serious technical problems. In 1995, one of its engines failed just after takeoff, and only months before the crash, it landed in Miami with its nose gear retracted after a hydraulic failure. Maintenance records showed corrosion and cracks, and Federal Aviation Administration files revealed the airline had collected more than 50 violations over 10 years, paying $49,000 in fines. The captain of the doomed flight had 3 years with Millon Air and was also qualified as a flight instructor, backed by a first officer, a flight engineer, and a loadmaster. Yet no amount of skill could overcome the catastrophic failure that struck on takeoff that night. The official investigation, involving Ecuadorian authorities along with the NTSB, Boeing, and Pratt & Whitney, concluded the cause was engine failure. For Millon Air, the tragedy was the breaking point. Already linked to another fatal accident a year earlier involving a leased DC-8 in Guatemala, the company ceased operations soon after. The crash of Flight 406 stands as a harsh reminder of how neglected maintenance, aging aircraft, and repeated warnings ignored can converge into disaster. Independent Air Flight 1851. On February 8, 1989, Independent Air Flight 1851 approached Santa Maria Island in the Azores, scheduled only for a refueling stop before heading toward Punta Cana. The Boeing 707 carried 137 Italian tourists eager for a Caribbean holiday, along with 7 American crew members. But instead of a routine descent, the aircraft was on a path toward Pico Alto, the island's highest peak. At 2:08 p.m., still flying level at 250 knots, it slammed into the mountainside at 1,795 feet. The impact tore the jet apart and ignited a massive explosion. Every one of the 144 people on board was lost, making it the deadliest aviation disaster in Portugal's history. The aircraft itself had a long past. Built in 1968, it once flew under TWA before joining Independent Air's small fleet of just two 707s. Captain Leon Doherty, 41 years old with over 7,700 hours of flight experience, was at the controls. His first officer had logged fewer than 70 hours on the 707, while the flight engineer was more seasoned. In the cabin, among the attendants was Yvette Murray, only 26, engaged to marry the captain that spring. Errors on multiple levels aligned to seal the fate of Flight 1851. The crew received outdated navigation charts, some not updated since 1962, and were guided by a trainee air traffic controller who issued the wrong barometric pressure. Phraseology confusion added to the miscommunication, with point mistaken for decimal, leading the pilots to misinterpret the cloud clearance. Worst of all, they descended to 2,000 feet, well below the 3,000-foot minimum safe altitude for that sector. By the time the ground proximity warning system screamed, "Pull up," the mountain was already beneath them. In the aftermath, families pressed for justice. A lawsuit ended with Independent Air and its leasing partner paying $34 million in settlements. Beyond the financial reckoning, the tragedy of Flight 1851 revealed how outdated charts, poor communication, and procedural lapses can turn a simple stopover into catastrophe. Transbrasil Flight 801. Late in the morning of March 21, 1989, Transbrasil Flight 801, a Boeing 707-349C, approached São Paulo's Guarulhos International Airport under tight time pressure. The crew knew runway 09R was scheduled to close for maintenance in just 6 minutes, so their approach came in fast. The aircraft heavy with over 26 tons of televisions and toys from Manaus. In those final moments, a critical mistake sealed the jet's fate. One of the crew inadvertently deployed the air brakes. The sudden drag bled away too much speed, and the 4-engine Boeing stalled less than 2 miles from the runway. At 11:54 a.m., the aircraft plunged into the Jardim Scintilla neighborhood, a densely populated slum. It hit the ground carrying more than 4,000 U.S. gallons of jet fuel, which ignited instantly. Flames tore through the wreckage, consuming homes and scattering twisted metal and shattered cargo across narrow streets. All 3 crew members on board were killed instantly. On the ground, 22 people lost their lives, and more than 200 were left injured, many with burns and traumatic wounds. The Boeing 707, registered PTTCS, had lived a long and colorful life. First flown in 1966, it logged over 61,000 flight hours and even appeared in the 1970 disaster film Airport. Before joining Transbrasil, it flew under the colors of Flying Tiger Line, Aer Lingus, El Al, and British Caledonian. Despite its age, it had passed inspection just 2 months earlier and was deemed airworthy. Investigators concluded the cause was human error, a rushed approach compounded by the mistaken deployment of the air brakes. No mechanical fault was found. For São Paulo's Guarulhos Airport, inaugurated just 4 years earlier, it was the first serious accident. The destruction left behind in Vila Barros turned a cargo jet's routine arrival into one of Brazil's most haunting aviation tragedies. Avianca Flight 052. In January 1990, Avianca Flight 052, a Boeing 707, was headed to New York City from Medellin, Colombia. The flight was well stocked with over 78,000 pounds of fuel for its journey, enough for the 2,000-mile trip and then some. However, as it neared its destination, the skies above John F. Kennedy International Airport were a mess, forcing the plane into 3 separate holding patterns. Each pass around the sky was a sip from the fuel tanks, draining the jet of its lifeblood. The flight crew knew they were in trouble. They radioed air traffic controllers, urgently stating they needed priority because they were running out of fuel. Yet, the controllers, hearing the term priority rather than the formal emergency, did not grasp the severity of the situation. This crucial misunderstanding, a gulf of language and protocol between the flight crew and the controllers, sealed the aircraft's fate. As the plane finally began its landing attempt, it was caught in a dangerous wind shear, causing it to descend too quickly before the crew executed a missed approach. With the aircraft now critically low on fuel, one engine flamed out, then another. The plane was a dead weight in the sky, a powerless glider with 158 people on board. It crashed onto a hillside in Cove Neck, New York, about 20 miles from the airport, with such force that the fuselage broke into 3 pieces. The crew members and passengers were thrown forward, and rescue efforts were hampered by dense fog and difficult terrain. In the end, the miscommunication and the perilous game of aerial waiting cost 73 people their lives. Pan Am Flight 816. On a humid July night in 1973, Pan Am Flight 816 lifted from the runway in Tahiti, carrying 79 souls on board, bound for Los Angeles and then San Francisco. The Boeing 707, named Clipper-winged Racer, was a workhorse of the skies, flown by an experienced crew led by Captain Robert Evarts, a man with over 25,000 hours in the air. Yet, within just 30 seconds of takeoff, the aircraft plunged into the dark waters off Papeete. 78 people perished. Only one man, James Campbell, a Canadian passenger, survived to tell the story, waking up in the ocean after bracing for impact. The flight had already been delayed by over an hour and a half due to a cracked windshield, a defect considered minor at the time, but enough to unsettle a crew who knew the 707 well. Extra fuel was loaded, swelling the aircraft's weight to over 315,000 pounds. The weather was poor, with rain and thick cloud cover pressing down over French Polynesia. Eyewitnesses later recalled seeing the plane veer sharply, and a flash split the night sky before it vanished into the sea. Search crews recovered just 12 bodies, along with Campbell, who was plucked from the waves. The black boxes lay unrecovered in 2,300 feet of water, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. The best theory pointed to instrument failure during climb-out, disorienting even such seasoned pilots.